Women snipers of the Soviet Union, the deadliest fighters you never learned about. A German officer is moving through the ruins of Stalingrad. He's experienced, cautious, a veteran of the Eastern Front. He knows this city is death. Every window, every pile of rubble, every shadow could hide a Soviet soldier. He pauses at a street corner, scans the buildings. Nothing moves. He signals his men to advance. A single shot rings out. The officer drops, killed instantly. His men scramble for cover, but they have no idea where the shot came from. No muzzle flash, no visible shooter. They wait. Minutes pass. Nothing. Carefully, a soldier moves to check on the officer. Another shot. Another man dead. The Germans retreat. They'll call in artillery, bomb the entire block rather than face whatever's hunting them in these ruins. What they don't know is that the shooter is a 19-year-old woman, a Soviet sniper named Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and by the end of the war, she will have killed 309 enemy soldiers, making her one of the deadliest snipers in human history. Welcome to Echoes of W2. Today we're going to tell you about something your history teacher almost certainly never mentioned. During World War II, the Soviet Union trained and deployed over 2,000 women as combat snipers. These weren't support personnel. These weren't nurses or factory workers. These were frontline soldiers who killed enemy combatants. In some of the most brutal combat of the war, they recorded over 12,000 confirmed kills. They became legends among Soviet forces and nightmares for the Germans. And after the war, most of them were completely forgotten. This is their story. Let's start with why this happened at all. Because in 1941, the idea of women in combat was considered absurd by most militaries in the world. Britain didn't allow women in combat roles. America didn't. Germany certainly didn't. Even the Soviet Union, despite its propaganda about gender equality, had never seriously deployed women as frontline soldiers. Then June 22, 1941 happened. Operation Barbarossa. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the largest military force ever assembled. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, over 2,000 aircraft. The invasion was catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Entire armies were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured in the first weeks. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. By October, they were approaching Moscow itself. The Soviet Union was facing annihilation. Stalin needed soldiers, millions of them, and he needed them immediately. The reality was simple. The Soviet Union didn't have enough men. Millions had already died. Millions more were needed to replace them. So Stalin made a decision that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The Soviet military would accept women volunteers for combat roles, not just as nurses or support staff, as actual combat soldiers, including snipers. This decision was driven by necessity, not ideology. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. If women could shoot, if they could fight, then they would be given the chance to do so. Thousands of young Soviet women volunteered. Some were motivated by patriotism. Some wanted revenge after family members were killed. Some simply believed it was their duty to defend their country. And some, honestly, saw it as a chance for adventure, for purpose, for something beyond the traditional roles women were expected to fill. The Soviet military established special training schools for women soldiers. One of the most important was the Central Women's School of Sniper Training, established in 1943. This school would train over 1,300 women as snipers before the war ended. But why snipers specifically? Why not infantry or tank crews or artillery? The answer is partly practical. Sniper work requires patience, precision, and the ability to remain motionless for hours. These aren't traditionally masculine traits. Military planners believed women might actually be well suited to this role. There is also the reality that sniper rifles are lighter than machine guns. The physical strength requirements are lower than for infantry carrying heavy equipment. Women could perform this role without the physical disadvantage they might face in other combat positions. And there was a psychological element. The Soviets understood that women snipers would have a particular psychological impact on German soldiers. Being killed by a woman was humiliating for men raised in Nazi ideology that glorified masculine martial prowess. The propaganda value was significant. The training was brutal. These weren't ceremonial soldiers or publicity stunts. The women who became snipers went through the same basic training as male soldiers. They learned marksmanship, camouflage, fieldcraft, and tactics. The sniper training itself was intense. Hours spent learning to judge distances, to read wind, to account for temperature and humidity, to control breathing and heartbeat, to squeeze a trigger smoothly without jerking, to remain absolutely still 4 hours waiting for a shot. They learned to construct camouflage positions, to move through terrain without being seen, to work in teams with a spotter, to survive in combat conditions, and they learned to kill, to see an enemy soldier through a scope and pull the trigger without hesitation. This wasn't abstract. This was preparing to shoot human beings at close enough range to see their faces. Some women couldn't handle it. They dropped out of training. But those who completed the program became some of the most effective soldiers in the Soviet military. By 1943, women snipers were being deployed to frontline units across the Eastern Front, and they began to prove that they were every bit as deadly as their male counterparts. Let me tell you about some of these women, because they weren't just statistics. They were real people with real stories. Lyudmila Pavlichenko is probably the most famous Soviet woman sniper. She was born in 1916 in Ukraine. In her youth, she joined a shooting club and discovered she had natural talent with a rifle. When the war started, she was a university student studying history. She volunteered immediately. The recruiting officer tried to steer her toward nursing. She insisted on combat. She was accepted into sniper training and deployed to defend Odessa in August 1941. Her first kills came quickly. Within her first month, she had killed dozens of enemy soldiers. She was calm under fire, patient, deadly accurate. When Odessa fell, she was evacuated to Sevastopol, where she continued fighting. The siege of Sevastopol lasted 250 days. Pavlichenko fought through the entire siege, moving through ruins and trenches, hunting German soldiers. By the time she was withdrawn from Sevastopol in 1942, she had 309 confirmed kills. She'd also been wounded 4 times. Shrapnel wounds from artillery. Minor injuries she refused to let stop her from fighting. The Soviet government recognized her value as a propaganda figure. They pulled her from combat and sent her on a goodwill tour to the United States and Britain. She became the first Soviet citizen to meet with an American president. When she visited Franklin Roosevelt, she spoke to audiences across America. She told them about the war on the Eastern Front, about the brutal fighting, about her experiences as a sniper. American audiences were fascinated and somewhat shocked by this young woman, who calmly discussed killing hundreds of men. There's a famous moment from her American tour. At one event, a reporter asked her, "Don't you think the skirt you're wearing is a bit too long?" This was while she was describing combat against Nazi forces. Pavlichenko's response was sharp. "I wear my skirt as I please. And I assure you that on the battlefield, the Germans care more about my rifle than my skirt length." She challenged American women to support the war effort, to take on greater roles, to understand the stakes of the conflict. Her speeches were powerful and direct, completely unlike the diplomatic platitudes most people expected. After the war, Pavlichenko returned to university and completed her history degree. She worked as a historian and never fought again. She died in 1974, having lived long enough to see her wartime service recognized, but never fully comfortable with her fame. Then there's Rosa Shanina. Born in 1924, she was only 17 when the war started. Her brother was killed in the first year of the war. Rosa wanted revenge. She completed sniper training in 1943 and was deployed to the Baltic front. She was extraordinarily skilled, known for her ability to hit moving targets and for successfully using a technique called doublet shooting, firing to quick shots in succession to ensure a kill. Shanina kept a diary during the war. It's one of the few first-hand accounts we have from a Soviet woman sniper. She wrote about the fear, the exhaustion, the satisfaction of successful missions, and the grief when friends were killed. Her entries are matter-of-fact about killing. She recorded each confirmed kill, described successful missions, but she also wrote about missing home, about wanting the war to end, about the toll combat was taking on her psychologically. Rosa Shanina was killed in January 1945, during the East Prussian offensive. She was shielding a wounded artillery officer when she was hit by shell fragments. She was 20 years old. She had 59 confirmed kills. Her diary survived. It provides a rare window into the thoughts and feelings of these women soldiers, who history has largely forgotten. Nina Lobkovskaya was another remarkable sniper. She was older than most women snipers, already in her 30s when she volunteered. She'd been a teacher before the war. She fought from 1943 until the end of the war, recording 89 confirmed kills. What made Lobkovskaya notable was her survival. Most women snipers were killed or wounded. Sniper work is extraordinarily dangerous. You're a high-value target. If the enemy locates you, they'll bring overwhelming force to kill you. Lobkovskaya survived the entire war and returned home. Olya Moldagulova was a Kazakh sniper, one of many non-Russian women who served. She was an orphan, raised in Soviet institutions. The war gave her purpose and identity. She became a skilled sniper, known for her aggression and willingness to take risks. She was killed in January 1944, during fighting in the Pskov region. She charged an enemy position after running out of ammunition, killing several German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat before being killed herself. She was 19 years old and had 91 confirmed kills. She was posthumously awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest honor. These stories repeat across the rosters of Soviet women snipers, young women, often teenagers, who learned to kill with precision, who served in brutal conditions, who were wounded, traumatized, and often killed, and who fought as effectively as any male soldier. The numbers are staggering. Over 2,000 women served as Soviet snipers during the war. Collectively, they recorded over 12,000 confirmed kills. To put that in perspective, that's more than the population of a small town. 12,000 enemy soldiers killed by women who weren't supposed to be capable of combat. Individual women recorded kills in the hundreds. Pavlichenko's 309. Natalia Kovshova with 167 before being killed in 1942. Maria Polivanova with 91 before being killed alongside Kovshova. Klavdia Kalagina with 257, surviving the war. Nina Petrova with 122. The list goes on. These weren't lucky shots. These were trained, skilled soldiers who consistently outperformed expectations and proved themselves equal to any male combatant. But what was it actually like? What did these women experience in combat? The testimony of survivors gives us glimpses, and it's clear that being a woman sniper came with unique challenges, beyond the standard horrors of war. First, there was the skepticism from male soldiers. Many Soviet men didn't believe women could be effective in combat. Women snipers had to prove themselves constantly. They had to be better than their male counterparts just to be taken seriously. Some male officers refused to believe women were capable of the work. They'd assign women snipers to rear positions or non-combat duties. It took direct intervention from higher command to ensure women snipers were actually deployed as snipers. But once they proved their effectiveness, attitudes changed. Male soldiers who fought alongside effective women snipers became their fiercest advocates. They'd seen these women in combat. They knew what they were capable of. Second, there was the physical hardship. Sniper positions were often in exposed, dangerous locations. Women snipers had to endure the same cold, hunger, exhaustion, and fear as male soldiers. They slept in trenches. They went days without hot food. They dealt with lice, disease, and wounds without proper medical care. And they did all this while dealing with practical issues male soldiers didn't face: menstruation in combat conditions, pregnancy risks if they had relationships, the lack of proper uniforms, with most women wearing modified men's uniforms that didn't fit properly, the difficulty of basic hygiene in the field. Third, there was the psychological pressure. Killing is traumatic regardless of gender, but women snipers faced additional psychological burdens. They were violating deeply ingrained social norms about femininity and violence. They were doing something that their entire upbringing had told them women shouldn't do. Some struggled with this, felt guilt or shame about becoming killers. Others compartmentalized, treating it as a job that had to be done. Still others embraced it, finding purpose and identity in their role as warriors. There's testimony from women snipers about the first kill being the hardest. Looking through the scope at a human face, seeing the enemy as a person, then pulling the trigger and watching him fall. Some women said they vomited after their first kill. Others said they felt nothing, just went looking for the next target. After the first kill, it became easier. Not easy, but easier. The enemy stopped being individuals and became targets. This is a common psychological adaptation in combat, but for women, who'd been socialized to be nurturers and caregivers, it was a particularly dramatic transformation. Fourth, there was the danger of capture. Soviet snipers, male or female, were high-value targets. The Germans hated snipers because they were so effective and because they created fear and paranoia. German standing orders were to execute captured snipers immediately. For women snipers, capture meant certain death, often preceded by torture and sexual violence. The Germans viewed women soldiers as unnatural, as violations of proper gender roles. Captured women soldiers were treated with particular brutality. Soviet women snipers knew this. They knew that surrender wasn't an option. They carried this knowledge into every engagement. Many women snipers kept a final bullet for themselves, preferring suicide to capture. There are documented cases of women snipers fighting to the death rather than be captured. Natalia Kovshova and Maria Polivanova, fighting together when they were surrounded, used their last grenades on themselves rather than surrender. They were posthumously awarded Hero of the Soviet Union. Fifth, there was the impact of watching friends die. Combat creates intense bonds. Women snipers often worked in pairs or small teams. They relied on each other for survival. When friends were killed, the psychological impact was devastating. Some women snipers reported that losing a partner was worse than any other aspect of combat. Worse than fear. Worse than the killing. Watching someone you trained with, fought beside, and trusted with your life get killed was trauma that many never fully recovered from. And the losses were constant. The casualty rates for Soviet snipers were high. Most women snipers were killed or seriously wounded during their service. The expectation was that you probably wouldn't survive the war. You accepted this and kept fighting because the alternative, Nazi victory, was unthinkable. 6. There was the question of relationships. Some women snipers had romances with male soldiers. Some got married. Some became pregnant. All of this created complications in combat zones. The Soviet military's official position was complicated. They wanted women soldiers to be warriors, but they also reinforced traditional gender roles in certain ways. Women who became pregnant were usually withdrawn from combat. Women who had relationships with multiple partners faced more judgment than men doing the same thing. Some women snipers avoided relationships entirely, fearing the complications. Others sought out human connection as a way to cope with the trauma of combat. There's no single story here, just individual women making choices in impossible circumstances. What comes through in the testimony of survivors is resilience. These women endured conditions that would break most people. They killed. They watched friends die. They lived in constant danger. They dealt with skepticism, harassment, and the unique burdens of being women in combat. And they kept fighting, day after day, month after month, for some, year after year, until the war ended. So what was the impact of these women snipers? Did they actually matter to the outcome of the war? The answer is complicated. The Eastern Front was a massive theater of war. Millions of soldiers fighting across thousands of miles. In that context, 2,000 women snipers were a tiny fraction of Soviet forces, but their impact was disproportionate to their numbers. Snipers are force multipliers. One skilled sniper can disrupt an entire enemy unit, can kill officers, destroy morale, create fear and paranoia. The 12,000 plus confirmed kills recorded by women snipers represented significant enemy losses, but more importantly, those kills had psychological effects that went beyond the raw numbers. German soldiers learned to fear Soviet snipers. The Eastern Front was already a nightmare for German forces. The brutal weather, the vast distances, the seemingly endless Soviet forces, adding the threat of invisible snipers who could kill you from hundreds of meters away, made it even worse. And knowing that some of those snipers were women was psychologically disturbing for German soldiers. Raised in Nazi ideology, the Nazis glorified masculine strength. The idea that German soldiers were being killed by women contradicted everything they'd been taught about natural gender hierarchies. Soviet propaganda exploited this. They publicized the achievements of women snipers, gave them medals and recognition, used them to demonstrate Soviet ideological superiority, claiming that Soviet women were tougher than German men. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's goodwill tour to America had strategic value. She demonstrated Soviet commitment and capability to Allied audiences. She challenged Western assumptions about gender roles and combat effectiveness. She was a living example of Soviet strength. For Soviet forces, women snipers had morale effects too. They showed that everyone could contribute to victory, that the Soviet Union was fighting a total war where traditional limitations were suspended, that women were as capable as men when given the opportunity. Some male soldiers were inspired by serving alongside effective women snipers. Others were shamed by the comparison, feeling obligated to match the courage and effectiveness these women demonstrated. There's also the practical impact on German tactics. Snipers forced German units to be more cautious, to advance more slowly, to expend resources on counter-sniper operations. Every hour a German unit spent dealing with snipers was an hour they weren't advancing or accomplishing their objectives. Did women snipers win the war? No. The Soviet Union won because of massive advantages in population, industrial capacity, and ultimately military force. But women snipers contributed. They killed enemy soldiers. They disrupted enemy operations. They provided intelligence. They boosted Soviet morale. In the calculus of total war, every contribution matters, and the contribution of Soviet women snipers was significant. After the war, what happened to these women? After spending years as trained killers, as combat soldiers, as warriors, what came next? The answer is complicated and often tragic. First, there's the simple fact that most didn't survive. Casualty rates for Soviet snipers were extremely high. Most women who served as snipers were killed or seriously wounded. The women we know about, the ones who survived to tell their stories, were the lucky ones. For those who did survive, returning to civilian life was difficult. They'd been transformed by combat. They'd seen and done things that most people couldn't imagine. They'd killed dozens or hundreds of people. They'd watched friends die. They'd lived with constant fear and adrenaline. And they returned to a society that wanted to forget they'd ever been soldiers. Stalin's Soviet Union, for all its propaganda about gender equality, was still a deeply traditional society in many ways. After the war, there was pressure for women to return to traditional roles, to become mothers and wives, to support men rather than compete with them. Women veterans, especially combat veterans, didn't fit this narrative. They were uncomfortable reminders of the war's desperation, of the fact that the Soviet Union had needed women to fight because so many men had died. Many women veterans faced discrimination, difficulty finding jobs, difficulty finding husbands, because men were intimidated by women who'd been soldiers, social judgment for having violated traditional gender roles. Some women snipers never married. Some struggled with trauma and mental health issues without adequate support. Some turned to alcohol. Some took their own lives. Unable to reconcile their wartime experiences with peacetime expectations, others managed to build successful lives. They got educations, found careers, started families, but they rarely talked about their wartime service. It was a chapter of their lives they kept private. The Soviet government gave medals and recognition to some women snipers. Pavlichenko and others received Hero of the Soviet Union honors, but the broader narrative of the war focused on male soldiers and male heroism. Women's contributions were acknowledged but downplayed. It wasn't until decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that researchers began documenting the full story of women's combat service, interviewing survivors, examining archives, piecing together a history that had been marginalized. What emerges from these later testimonies is remarkable resilience, but also deep pain. Women who'd been warriors at 19 spent the rest of their lives trying to reconcile that identity with social expectations about femininity. Some never fully succeeded. There's also pride. Despite the trauma, despite the difficulties of readjustment, many women veterans were proud of what they'd done. They defended their country. They'd proven themselves in the most demanding circumstances. They'd saved lives by taking lives. And they'd shown that women were capable of anything men could do, including the brutal work of combat. This is Echoes of W2. Over 2,000 Soviet women served as combat snipers during World War II. They recorded over 12,000 confirmed kills. They fought in some of the war's most brutal battles. They proved themselves equal to any male soldier. Your history teacher probably didn't tell you about them. The standard narratives of World War II focus on male soldiers, male generals, male heroism. Women are nurses and factory workers and victims, not warriors. But Lyudmila Pavlichenko was a warrior, with 309 kills. Rosa Shanina was a warrior, with 59 kills and a diary recording her transformation from teenage girl to trained killer. Nina Lobkovskaya was a warrior, surviving the entire war with 89 kills. Olya Moldagulova was a warrior, dying at 19 after killing 91 enemy soldiers. They were all warriors. 2,000 women who picked up rifles and fought and killed and died defending their country. Now you know. Now you know that women fought in World War II, not just as support personnel, but as frontline combat soldiers, that they were skilled, effective, and deadly, that they challenged every assumption about gender and combat, that they deserve to be remembered not as curiosities or footnotes, but as soldiers who served with honor and effectiveness. Now you know the story of the Soviet women snipers, the deadliest women in history, and the warriors your history teacher forgot to mention.